Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. The year is 1656. The Ottoman Empire, a giant bleeding from 1,000 cuts, is on the verge of collapse. A 7-year-old boy, Sultan Mehmed IV, sits on the throne, a pawn in the deadly games of his grandmother and mother. The treasury is empty, the army is in revolt, and Venice blockades the Dardanelles. In this hour of desperation, the court turns to a forgotten 80-year-old Albanian pasha. His name is Köprülü Mehmed. He makes a demand unprecedented in Ottoman history. Grant me absolute, unquestionable power, and I will save your empire. This is not the story of a sultan. It is the story of the dynasty of Grand Viziers who became the true masters of the throne, the mid-17th century. The once mighty Ottoman Empire, the terror of Christendom and the master of 3 continents, was rotting from the inside. The disciplined terror of Sultan Murad IV, the last of the great warrior sultans, was a fading memory. In his place sat his brother, Ibrahim, a man broken by decades of gilded imprisonment in the palace cage, a ruler whose reign descended into a maelstrom of debauchery and madness. His whims dictated policy. He lavished fortunes on sable furs and amber, while soldiers went unpaid and the state teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Power did not reside in the sultan's divan, but in the shadows of the harem, in the whispers between the Valide Sultan Kösem and her favored courtiers. It festered in the barracks of the janissaries, who had devolved from the empire's elite fighting force into a corrupt and entitled Praetorian Guard, kingmakers and kingbreakers who held the capital hostage. Their loyalty was not to the state, but to the highest bidder. The empire was a ship without a captain, tossed on a sea of intrigue. Rebellions flared in Anatolia. The long, grinding Cretan War against Venice was draining the treasury and costing thousands of lives with no end in sight. The Venetian fleet, emboldened by Ottoman weakness, blockaded the Dardanelles, strangling the lifeblood of Constantinople itself. Famine gripped the capital. The currency was debased, the bureaucracy paralyzed by corruption. Every official, from the highest vizier to the lowest tax collector, sought only personal enrichment. The system that had conquered half the world was now consuming itself. The deposition and execution of Ibrahim the Mad in 1648 was not a solution. It was merely a symptom of the disease. The throne was now empty, and into this vortex of chaos a child would be thrown. He was just 6 years old. Mehmed IV ascended the throne of Osman not as a conqueror, but as a pawn. His father's blood was still fresh on the hands of the conspirators who had placed him there. The boy, Sultan, was a symbol, a fragile vessel for the ambitions of others. Real power was a prize to be fought for between 2 formidable women, his grandmother, the Valide Sultan Kösem, and his mother, Turhan Hatice. It was the apex of the so-called Sultanate of Women. But this was not an era of enlightened female rule. It was a bitter, personal war that tore the government apart. Kösem, the veteran matriarch who had guided the empire through multiple reigns, saw her young grandson as her final instrument of power. She declared herself regent, sidelining the boy's own mother. Turhan, young and initially inexperienced, was not one to be underestimated. She began to build her own faction, a network of loyal eunuchs and officials who saw their future tied to hers. The palace became a snake pit. Every appointment, every military decision, every decree was a move in their deadly game. The Grand Viziers appointed during this period were puppets, their tenures measured in months, sometimes weeks. They were installed by one faction only to be undermined and executed by the other. While the 2 women battled for control of a child, the empire burned. The Venetian blockade tightened. The janissaries, manipulated by Kösem, mutinied at will. In 1651, the conflict reached its bloody climax. Turhan, learning of a plot by Kösem to poison young Mehmed and replace him with a more pliable grandson, struck first. Her loyalists stormed Kösem's chambers in the dead of night. The most powerful woman in Ottoman history was found hiding in a cabinet and was brutally strangled with a curtain cord. Turhan had won, but her victory was hollow. She was now regent, but the state was in ruins. With Kösem dead, Turhan Sultan held the reins of power, but the horse was running wild towards a cliff. The crisis had reached its zenith. In 1656, the Venetian navy inflicted a catastrophic defeat upon the Ottomans at the Battle of the Dardanelles. They destroyed the fleet, killed the Grand Admiral, and tightened their stranglehold on the capital. Panic seized Constantinople. The people were starving, the treasury was empty, and the soldiers were on the verge of open revolt. Turhan, a regent in a world that despised female authority, was desperate. She had cycled through more than a dozen Grand Viziers, each one proving more incompetent or corrupt than the last. The state needed a savior, not another placeholder. Her advisers, scraping the bottom of the barrel, mentioned a name: Köprülü Mehmed Pasha. It was a strange suggestion. Köprülü was ancient, well over 70 years old. He was a provincial administrator of Albanian origin, with a reputation for competence but little experience at the center of power. He was living in quiet retirement, a relic from a bygone era. Desperate times, however, called for desperate measures. The Valide Sultan summoned the old Pasha for an audience. What followed was one of the most extraordinary negotiations in Ottoman history. Köprülü Mehmed did not beg for the position. He dictated the terms of his acceptance. He knew the system was broken, poisoned by the interference of the palace, the army, and the clergy. He would not be another disposable vizier. He made 4 conditions. First, that his decisions would be absolute and unchallengeable. Second, that he would have complete authority over all appointments and dismissals, from the highest general to the lowest clerk. Third, that no one, not even the Valide Sultan herself, could interfere with his administration, and fourth, that no rival could be allowed to conspire against him in the palace. He was not asking for the office of Grand Vizier, he was demanding the power of a dictator. It was an unprecedented ultimatum, a surrender of royal authority. Turhan Sultan, with the fate of the dynasty in her hands, had no choice but to agree. On September 15, 1656, the imperial seal was placed in the hands of Köprülü Mehmed Pasha. The empire held its breath. The cure, it would soon discover, was to be as brutal as the disease. The Iron Vizier unleashed a reign of terror unlike anything seen in generations. His first acts were not of reform, but of purification by blood. He moved with chilling speed and precision. The Grand Vizier wasted no time on investigations or trials. Rumor and suspicion were enough. The military commanders who had failed at the Dardanelles were summarily executed. Janissary officers who had plotted rebellions found their careers and lives ending on the same day. He purged the cavalry, hanging thousands of corrupt sipahis who had been drawing pay for non-existent soldiers. His wrath extended to the religious establishment. When the Greek Orthodox Patriarch was accused of treasonous dealings with Venice, Köprülü had him hanged from the gates of his own patriarchate, a stark message to any who would dare defy the state. Bureaucrats who had enriched themselves through graft were stripped of their wealth and their heads. The palace itself was not immune. He exiled Turhan Sultan's meddling allies, reminding the regent of the absolute power she had granted him. Fear became the primary tool of governance. The chaos that had defined the capital for decades was replaced by a rigid, terrifying order. But beneath the terror, there was a purpose. With all opposition silenced, Köprülü began the hard work of restoration. He reformed the tax system, replenishing the empty treasury. He personally oversaw the rebuilding of the navy and the retraining of the army, imposing the iron discipline of a bygone age. Within a year, the results were undeniable. The Venetian blockade was broken. Rebellions in the provinces were crushed. The state, which had been on the verge of total collapse, was stabilized. Köprülü Mehmed had saved the Ottoman Empire, not by consensus or compromise, but through sheer, unadulterated force. He had arrested the decline, but at a terrible price, forging a new path with steel and blood. With the imperial seal in his hand, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha did not celebrate. He began to work. The authority granted to him by the desperate Valide Sultan was absolute, a blank check of power unheard of for a Grand Vizier, and he intended to cash it in blood. His first target was the very heart of the rot, the palace itself. For years, Topkapı had been a nest of vipers, a chaotic marketplace of influence where eunuchs, harem favorites, and military commanders conspired for wealth and position, while the state bled. Köprülü's arrival was not a negotiation, it was a judgment. The whispers in the gilded corridors turned to screams. He moved with a speed that paralyzed his enemies. The Grand Mufti, the highest religious authority, was exiled. The commanders of the Janissary and Sipahi Corps who had held the capital hostage were summoned and summarily executed. Their heads were displayed on the palace gates, a grotesque and undeniable statement that a new era had begun. He dismantled the networks of corruption that had siphoned off state funds, targeting officials who had grown fat while soldiers went unpaid. But his purge was not limited to Muslims. When he uncovered evidence that the Greek Orthodox Patriarch was engaged in treasonous correspondence with the empire's enemies, he had him hanged without hesitation, sending a shockwave through the Christian communities and a clear message to foreign powers. The internal weaknesses they had exploited were being cauterized. This was not reform, it was radical surgery without anesthetic. The fear was palpable. Every official, from the highest minister to the lowest scribe, now understood that their life depended not on their connections, but on their loyalty and competence. Köprülü was forging a new state from the embers of the old, and the fire he used was terror. Köprülü Mehmed's purge radiated outwards from the palace, a seismic shock that trembled the foundations of the entire empire. His methods were brutal, but they were not random. They were driven by a cold, calculating logic aimed at restoring the two pillars of the Ottoman state, justice and order. His instruments were the axe and the law, wielded with equal ferocity. Across the vast provinces from the Balkans to Egypt, governors and local lords had long ruled as petty kings, enriching themselves through extortion and ignoring decrees from the capital. Köprülü dispatched loyal and incorruptible investigators, armed with his absolute authority. Their reports were not filed away to gather dust. They were death sentences. Governors who had skimmed taxes, judges who had sold verdicts, and military commanders who had abused their power were hunted down. There were no lengthy trials, no appeals to powerful patrons in the capital. Those patrons were already dead or in exile. There was only the swift, sharp judgment of the executioner. It is estimated that in his 5 years in power, tens of thousands of officials, soldiers, and rebels met their end. Yet this reign of terror was paradoxically a restoration of security for the common subject. For the first time in a generation, the roads became safer. Tax collection, while still harsh, became predictable and regulated, flowing into the state treasury instead of private pockets. The law, which had become a tool for the rich, once again offered a semblance of protection to the powerless. Köprülü was demonstrating a terrifying truth of power. Sometimes the restoration of order requires a level of brutality that borders on tyranny. He was tearing down the diseased structure of the state, not to destroy it, but to build it anew on the old, solid foundations of fear and obedience. While Köprülü Mehmed Pasha purged the land, a mortal threat choked the empire from the sea. The Venetian navy, masters of the Mediterranean, had blockaded the Dardanelles, the vital strait connecting the Aegean Sea to Constantinople. This was no mere naval maneuver. It was a garrote tightening around the empire's throat. The capital faced starvation, and the long, grueling war to conquer Crete was on the verge of collapse, its armies cut off from supplies and reinforcements. The Ottoman navy was in a state of disrepair, its commanders incompetent and its crews mutinous. Previous attempts to break the blockade had ended in catastrophic defeat. For Köprülü, this was the ultimate test. His internal reforms would mean nothing if the capital itself fell. He poured the newly replenished state treasury into rebuilding the fleet with a terrifying urgency. Shipyards worked day and night. Any commander who showed the slightest hint of cowardice or incompetence was executed on the spot. He appointed a new, aggressive Köprülü Pasha, Topal Mehmed, and gave him one simple command: succeed or die. In the summer of 1657, the new Ottoman fleet sailed to meet its destiny. The ensuing Battle of the Dardanelles was a brutal, desperate affair. For 2 days, cannons roared and ships burned. But this time, the Ottoman sailors fought with a discipline born of fear and a renewed sense of purpose. They broke the Venetian line. The blockade was shattered. As Ottoman supply ships once again sailed freely towards Crete, a wave of relief washed over Constantinople. Köprülü had achieved what no one thought possible. He had not only saved the capital and the war effort, but he had also announced to a watching Europe that the Ottoman Empire was no longer a dying patient. The old lion had awoken, and its claws were sharp. In the shadow of the formidable Grand Vizier, a young man was growing up. Sultan Mehmed IV, placed on the throne as a child, was now entering manhood. He was the source of all Köprülü's legitimate power. The imperial seal was his, the decrees issued in his name. Yet he was a carefully managed sovereign, a gilded centerpiece kept far from the intricate and bloody machinery of state. Köprülü understood the delicate balance he had to maintain. The Sultan could not be seen as a prisoner, but he could never be allowed to interfere. The Grand Vizier astutely encouraged the young Sultan's passions, chief among them the hunt. Mehmed IV became known as Avcı, the hunter, spending weeks, sometimes months, away from the capital on lavish hunting expeditions in the forests of Edirne. These were not mere diversions. They were grand imperial spectacles that projected an image of a vigorous, powerful monarch, reinforcing the stability of the dynasty. While the Sultan tracked deer and boar, Köprülü tracked corrupt officials and foreign spies. This arrangement suited both. The Sultan enjoyed the pageantry and freedom of the royal hunt without the crushing burden of governance, and the Grand Vizier had a free hand to remake the empire. But as Mehmed IV matured, a quiet tension grew. He was intelligent, observant, and increasingly aware of the immense power wielded by the man who served him. Köprülü, now an old man, knew his time was short. His final, brilliant political maneuver was to ensure this unique power structure would outlive him. He began preparing his brilliant and capable son, Fazıl Ahmed, to succeed him, not just as an advisor, but as the next de facto ruler. The Sultan was coming of age, but the age of the Köprülüs was just beginning. In the autumn of 1661, the old lion, Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, lay dying. He had forged order from chaos with an iron will and rivers of blood. The empire held its breath. Would his death plunge the state back into the anarchy he had so brutally suppressed? The Sultan, Mehmed IV, a young man more interested in the hunt than the throne room, stood by the deathbed. It was here that the most audacious transfer of power in a generation occurred. The dying Grand Vizier, with his last ounce of strength, did not simply return the imperial seal to his sovereign. He recommended a successor, his own son, Fazıl Ahmed. It was an unprecedented act, an attempt to create a hereditary dynasty of Grand Viziers. The court was stunned. Fazıl Ahmed was only 26, a scholar and an administrator, not a grizzled warrior like his father. He was known for his intellect, his calm demeanor, and his refined tastes, qualities that many in the military elite mistook for weakness. They saw a cub, not a lion. But the Sultan, who had known nothing but the firm hand of the elder Köprülü, agreed. He placed the fate of the world's most powerful empire into the hands of a young man who had never led an army into battle. This was the ultimate gamble. Fazl Ahmed inherited not just the seal, but his father's fearsome reputation and the machinery of state his father had rebuilt. He was surrounded by his father's appointees, men loyal to the Köprülü name, not necessarily the Sultan. The question on every courtier's lips was whispered, never spoken aloud. Would the cub be a pale imitation of the lion, or would his quiet, scholarly nature hide a cunning and strength all its own? The transition was deceptively smooth, but it was a silent revolution. The Grand Vizierate was no longer just an office. It was becoming a throne in its own right, and Fazl Ahmed Pasha was its new, untested king. The whispers of weakness followed Fazl Ahmed Pasha from the palace halls to the military camps. The Janissaries and the frontier generals, men of action and raw courage, saw a bookish administrator. They would soon be corrected. In 1663, conflict with the Habsburgs erupted once more along the Hungarian frontier. This was Fazl Ahmed's first great test, his trial by fire. He did not shrink from it, he embraced it, but on his own terms. This was not to be a war of brute force, but of meticulous, scholarly precision. He spent months in Edirne, poring over maps, supply ledgers, and intelligence reports. His preparations were exhaustive, a logistical masterpiece that stunned his more experienced commanders. When the Grand Imperial Army finally marched, it moved with a purpose and efficiency not seen in decades. The objective was the formidable fortress of Ujvar, or Nove Zamki, the linchpin of the Habsburg defense. Fazl Ahmed personally directed the siege, his strategic mind dissecting the fortress's defenses like a complex legal text. When Ujvar fell, a shockwave went through Europe. A popular Turkish saying was born, "As strong as a Turk before Ujvar." The campaign culminated the following year at the Battle of St. Gotthard. Here, facing a united European army, the Ottomans suffered a rare and bloody tactical defeat. A lesser commander might have panicked, his army might have disintegrated. But Fazl Ahmed's discipline held, and his strategic genius turned military loss into political victory. He understood that the Habsburgs were exhausted, their treasury drained by the war. Despite the setback on the battlefield, he negotiated the Peace of Vasvar from a position of strength. The treaty was astonishingly favorable to the Ottomans, securing their territorial gains and reasserting their dominance. The scholar had proven he was more than a match for Europe's greatest generals. He had shown the world that a sharp mind was a more lethal weapon than a sharp sword. For 24 years, the island of Crete had been a bleeding wound in the side of the Ottoman Empire. The war with Venice, ignited in 1645, had consumed countless lives and fortunes. All that remained of Venetian power was the city of Candia, a fortress so immense, so brilliantly engineered, that it had become a legend of impenetrability. It was the longest siege in history, a generational struggle that had broken armies and bankrupted treasuries. By the 1660s, the war had devolved into a stalemate, a hellish landscape of trenches, mines, and constant grinding attrition. In 1666, Fazl Ahmed Pasha decided the wound must be cauterized. He took personal command, arriving with fresh troops and an unbreakable will to finish what 3 sultans had failed to achieve. He brought the full, terrifying weight of the Ottoman war machine to bear on the doomed city. The final 3 years of the siege were an inferno. Ottoman sappers dug miles of tunnels, seeking to plant explosives beneath the city's 54 bastions. Venetian and European defenders dug countermines, leading to horrific blind battles fought with picks and daggers in the suffocating darkness beneath the earth. Above ground, the world's largest cannons pounded the walls day and night, reducing stone to dust. Disease ran rampant, and the casualty count was astronomical on both sides. But Fazl Ahmed's resolve never wavered. He lived in the trenches with his men, sharing their dangers, driving them forward with a quiet, terrifying intensity. Finally, in September 1669, the heroic but exhausted Venetian commander, Francesco Morosini, accepted the inevitable. Candia surrendered. After a quarter-century of bloodshed, Crete belonged to the Sultan. The victory was monumental. It ended Venice's maritime empire in the Aegean and secured Ottoman control of the eastern Mediterranean. For Fazıl Ahmed, it was his crowning achievement, a victory of pure, relentless will that cemented his legacy as one of the empire's greatest conquerors. With the fall of Crete and the pacification of the Habsburg frontier, a rare and welcome peace settled over the Ottoman Empire. The wars were won, the treasury was exhausted, and the land was weary. It was in this moment of quiet that Fazıl Ahmed Pasha revealed the other side of his genius. The conqueror became the statesman, and his tenure would be remembered as the golden age of the Köprülü dynasty. He turned his methodical, precise mind from the arts of war to the arts of governance. Unlike his father, who ruled through terror, Fazıl Ahmed ruled through competence. He initiated significant fiscal reforms, lightening the tax burden on the peasantry to spur economic recovery. He streamlined the bureaucracy, promoting officials based on merit rather than bribery, a radical concept in a system rife with corruption. While Sultan Mehmed IV indulged in colossal hunting expeditions, sometimes staying away from the capital for months on end, Fazıl Ahmed governed. The Divan, the imperial council, met not in Topkapı Palace, but at the Grand Vizier's own residence, the Sublime Porte. It was here that ambassadors groveled, policies were forged, and the fate of millions was decided. The Sultan reigned, but the Köprülü ruled. This period also saw a flourishing of culture. A scholar himself, Fazıl Ahmed was a great patron of poets, historians, and architects. He established a magnificent library in Constantinople that became a hub of intellectual life. Under his guidance, the empire was stable, prosperous, and secure. It was the fulfillment of his father's vision, achieved with a scalpel rather than an axe. For 15 years, he provided the empire with what it desperately needed: intelligent, decisive, and stable leadership. When he died in 1676, he left behind an empire stronger than it had been in a century, and a Grand Vizierate more powerful than the Sultanate itself. He had not just been the lion's cub, he had become a lion in his own right, casting a shadow so vast it would define the ambitions of all who followed. The Köprülü name was a dynasty of statecraft, a seal of genius. But the man who would take their legacy to its most dramatic and catastrophic precipice was not a Köprülü by blood. He was Merzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man adopted into the household who secured his position by marrying into the family. He was the ambitious son-in-law, and his ambition burned with the heat of 1,000 suns. When his brother-in-law, the brilliant Fazıl Ahmed, died in 1676, the mantle of Grand Vizier fell to him. It was a transfer of power that felt both inevitable and deeply perilous. Where the first Köprülüs were restorers, pragmatic and brutal in their quest for order, Kara Mustafa was a visionary of a different sort. He did not seek to merely manage the empire. He sought to glorify it, and in doing so, to immortalize himself. He possessed the Köprülü intelligence and capacity for administration, but lacked their crucial restraint. His pride was legendary, his appetite for wealth and splendor insatiable. In his mind, the Ottoman Empire was not an aging power to be carefully preserved, but a divine weapon to be wielded. He saw himself as the heir to the great conquerors, a man destined to succeed where even the magnificent Suleiman had failed. He learned to manage the Sultan, Mehmed IV, with practiced ease, understanding that the monarch's obsession with the hunt was a gift. It kept the Sultan distracted, far from the intricate web of power Kara Mustafa was weaving in Constantinople. Every lavish hunt, every month spent in the forests of Edirne, ceded more authority to the Grand Vizier. While the Sultan chased deer, Kara Mustafa was chasing destiny, consolidating his control over the army, the treasury, and the bureaucracy. He was building a power base not just to govern, but to launch the single greatest military gamble in a century: The target was already a whisper, a feverish dream solidifying into a plan. The heart of the Habsburg lands, the Golden Apple, Vienna. Sultan Mehmed IV was known as Avcı, the hunter. The title was not merely ceremonial, it was the defining passion of his life. Ascending to the throne as a boy of 6, his entire reign had been shaped by powerful figures. His grandmother, the formidable Kösem Sultan, and then the unbroken line of Köprülü Viziers. They had stabilized his empire, but in doing so had taught him to delegate, to trust, to reign rather than rule. By the time Kara Mustafa took power, the Sultan's detachment from state affairs was complete. His court was not in the Topkapi Palace, but in the saddle, chasing game across the vast plains of Thrace. These were not simple excursions. They were colossal imperial processions, involving thousands of retainers, lasting for months on end. This was the indulgence that fueled Kara Mustafa's ambition. The Grand Vizier actively encouraged the Sultan's passion, presenting state affairs as stable and secure, freeing the monarch to pursue his pleasures. With the Sultan away, the Sublime Porte was no longer a gate to the palace, but the gate to Kara Mustafa's personal fiefdom. He became the de facto ruler of the Ottoman Empire in all but name. He appointed governors, dismissed generals, and controlled the flow of gold into and out of the treasury. His personal wealth swelled to mythical proportions, his palace rivaling the Sultan's in its opulence. He was the sun around which the entire Ottoman administration now orbited. But this was not simple corruption or a quiet usurpation of power. Every decision, every ducat accumulated, every appointment made was a step towards a singular goal. Kara Mustafa saw the Sultan's absence not as a vacuum, but as an opportunity. It gave him the freedom to marshal the vast resources of a transcontinental empire, to sharpen its military edge, and to direct its full might toward his own monumental obsession. The Hunter King was content with his game, unaware that his Grand Vizier was stalking a much larger prize. In 1683, the pretext for glory arrived. In Habsburg-controlled Hungary, Protestant nobles led by Imre Tököly rose in rebellion against the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. Tököly, desperate for an ally, turned to the Ottoman Sultan, pledging his allegiance in exchange for protection. For Kara Mustafa, this was the divine signal he had been waiting for. He framed the conflict not as a risky foreign adventure, but as a sacred duty to protect oppressed Muslims and their allies, a jihad that would bring immense prestige and wealth to the empire. In the imperial divan, he silenced the voices of caution. Experienced pashas who warned of the immense logistical challenges of a campaign so deep into Europe were dismissed as cowards. The Sultan, presented with a vision of holy war and unparalleled glory, gave his blessing. The Ottoman war machine, dormant for too long, roared to life. From Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, and the Balkans, the summons went out. It was to be the largest imperial army mobilized in living memory. The elite Janissaries, the Sipahi cavalry, the fearsome Crimean Tatar horsemen, and auxiliary forces from vassal states. A river of humanity, a torrent of steel, began to flow towards the assembly point at Edirne. On March 31, 1683, the army began its slow, inexorable march west. The spectacle was a terrifying declaration of intent. The imperial standards, the endless columns of soldiers, the thunderous rhythm of the Mater military band, it was the empire in motion. At the head of this magnificent and terrifying force rode Kara Mustafa Pasha. He was at the zenith of his power, an absolute commander leading an army he believed to be invincible. He was no longer just a vizier. He was a conqueror in the mold of his ancestors. Every step closer to the Danube was a step closer to his destiny. He was not just marching on a city, he was marching towards his own legend, convinced that the gates of Vienna were the gates to immortality. In early July 1683, the apocalypse arrived on the horizon. From the walls of Vienna, the defenders watched in disbelief as the vanguard of the Ottoman army, the swift and brutal Crimean Tatars, swarmed across the plains, burning villages and sowing terror. Soon after, the main host appeared, a seemingly endless ocean of men and animals that blotted out the landscape. Emperor Leopold I and his court had already fled, leaving the city's defense in the hands of Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg and a garrison of some 15,000 soldiers. The city held its breath. The fate of Christendom seemed to rest on its walls. Kara Mustafa, surveying the formidable defenses, made his first and perhaps most critical mistake. Overconfident in his overwhelming numerical superiority and eager to seize the city's legendary riches intact, he chose not to order an immediate all-out assault that might have overwhelmed the defenders. Instead, he opted for a formal siege. He wanted to claim the golden apple whole, not smash it to pieces. On July 14th, the investment was complete. Vienna was cut off from the world. The Ottoman army began its methodical, terrifying work. Thousands of men dug, creating a complex network of parallel trenches and zigzagging saps, a creeping system of earthworks designed to bring them ever closer to the city walls, safe from defensive fire. The great Ottoman siege cannons, some of the most powerful in the world, opened their bombardment. Day and night, the city shook with the percussive roar of artillery, the stone walls of the great bastions slowly crumbling under the relentless assault. Inside Kara Mustafa's camp, a city of luxurious silk tents, the Grand Vizier held court like a conquering emperor, receiving emissaries and planning the administration of his new territory. He believed victory was a matter of time. For the starving, exhausted defenders on the walls, time was the enemy. They were locked in a desperate struggle against a creeping, suffocating death, praying for a relief army that might never come. For weeks, the Ottoman camp before Vienna had been a city unto itself, a sprawling testament to imperial might. Within his opulent tent, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha dismissed the increasingly frantic reports. Scouts spoke of a great Christian army massing on the Kahlenberg Heights, the forested hills that loomed over the siege lines. He scoffed. Let them come. His janissaries were on the verge of breaching the city's final defenses. The prize was within his grasp. He had left his rearguard weak, his main force committed to the assault, a decision born of supreme, almost divine self-assurance. But on the morning of September 12, 1683, that assurance began to crumble. The morning mists over the hills burned away to reveal a sight that defied belief. A vast European army, a holy league of Poles, Austrians, and Germans, had assembled as if from nowhere, and at their head a force of legend, the Polish winged hussars, their great feathered wings arching from their backs, creating an unearthly, terrifying silhouette against the sky. From the Ottoman trenches, soldiers looked up in disbelief, then in dawning horror. This was not the beleaguered garrison they had been fighting. This was something else entirely. For hours, the battle raged on the slopes, the Ottoman forces caught between the city walls and the descending tide of steel. Kara Mustafa, finally grasping the scale of his miscalculation, tried to rally his men, but the momentum was lost. In the late afternoon, King John Sobieski gave the order. With a sound like thunder, 3,000 winged hussars led the largest cavalry charge in history. They did not just break the Ottoman lines, they shattered them. It was a psychological cataclysm. The invincible army of the Sultan, the terror of Christendom, dissolved into a panicked mob, fleeing for their lives, abandoning the siege, the cannons, the treasure, and the Grand Vizier's own magnificent tent. The dream of Vienna had died in a storm of Polish lances. The road from Vienna was not a retreat, it was a hemorrhage. The once proud Ottoman army, the most disciplined fighting force in the world, was now a demoralized rabble, streaming eastward in disarray. At its head rode Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man entombed in a silence more terrible than any scream. Every league they covered was a testament to his failure. The vast train of supplies, the heavy siege cannons, the spoils of 100 captured towns, all left behind, now in the hands of the triumphant Christians. Harried by coalition cavalry and consumed by internal dissent, the army bled men and materiel. Kara Mustafa's mind, once a sharp instrument of imperial policy, now turned to a single, desperate objective: survival. Not from the enemy at his back, but from the Sultan in Constantinople. He knew the unwritten law of the Ottoman court. Victory had many fathers, but catastrophic failure had only one. To save himself, he needed scapegoats. He began a brutal purge of his own commanders. Ibrahim Pasha of Buda, a respected veteran, was one of the first to die, strangled in his tent on the Grand Vizier's orders. Others followed. Accusations of cowardice and treason were leveled against any who might challenge his narrative, any who might carry a different version of the Vienna debacle back to the capital. Each execution was a desperate gamble, an attempt to cauterize a wound that was already septic. But the news of the disaster traveled faster than his executioners. As the ragged remains of his army limped towards Belgrade, the true scale of the loss became undeniable. He had lost more than a battle. He had lost the aura of invincibility that had protected the Köprülü name for decades. He was no longer the Shadow Sultan, the master of the empire. He was a defeated general on a long, cold ride to face a master who did not tolerate failure. Kara Mustafa Pasha reached Belgrade in December, a city shrouded in winter gloom that mirrored the darkness in his own soul. He still clung to a sliver of hope. He was, after all, a Köprülü by marriage and adoption. He had served the state, won victories, and expanded the empire's borders. Perhaps his past service would outweigh this one monumental failure. He sent lavish gifts to Sultan Mehmed IV, along with carefully worded reports that shifted blame and minimized the scale of the defeat. For a few weeks, an unnerving silence emanated from the Topkapi Palace. Then, on Christmas Day, they arrived. The Sultan's emissaries, the Köprülü Basha, the chief gatekeepers of the palace, entered his chambers. They did not come with questions or demands for an explanation. They came with the imperial firman, the Sultan's decree. The air grew thick with ceremony and dread. Kara Mustafa knew the ritual. He knew what the silk cord, coiled in a velvet bag, signified. There was no trial, no appeal. This was the cold, swift justice of the Padishah. He was ordered to surrender the symbols of his office, the seal of the empire, the holy standard, and the keys to the Kaaba. As he handed them over, he was no longer the Grand Vizier, but merely a servant awaiting his master's final command. He was granted a moment for his final ablutions and prayers. In the stark quiet of the room, surrounded by the impassive faces of the Sultan's men, the adopted son of the great Köprülü Mehmed Pasha knelt. The silk cord was looped around his neck. It was the designated method for high officials, a death without the spilling of blood. A sharp, brutal pull, and it was over. His head was severed and sent to Mehmed IV as proof that the price of Vienna had been paid. The Sultan had his scapegoat, but the empire had a wound that would never fully heal. The execution of Kara Mustafa Pasha was more than the end of one man. It was the violent, shuddering end of an era. The Köprülü project, which had begun nearly 30 years earlier with Köprülü Mehmed Pasha's iron-fisted restoration of order, had reached its zenith and then spectacularly collapsed at the gates of Vienna. The family had rescued the empire from anarchy, centralized its power, and restored its military might, making the Grand Vizierate the true center of gravity in the Ottoman state. They were the shadow rulers, wielding power that often eclipsed that of the Sultan himself. But their ambition contained the seeds of its own destruction. Kara Mustafa's grand gamble was a product of the very power and autonomy the Köprülüs had cultivated. He acted with the authority of a monarch, and when he failed, the entire system they had built was implicated in his ruin. The defeat initiated the Great Turkish War, a grueling 16-year conflict that saw the Ottomans lose vast territories in Hungary, Greece, and along the Black Sea for the first time. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was irrevocably broken. The balance of power in Europe shifted permanently. Sultan Mehmed IV, the monarch who had ceded so much authority to his viziers, could not escape the consequences. Blamed for the endless war and the empire's humiliation, he was deposed by his own army in 1687. The Köprülü legacy is therefore a profound paradox. They were the architects of the empire's last great age of stability and expansion, brilliant administrators who arrested a seemingly terminal decline. Yet their final act of hubris unleashed a catastrophe that set the stage for the long, slow retreat of Ottoman power, a decline that would last for the next 2 centuries. They were the empire's saviors and ultimately the authors of its most defining failure.